Okay, so let's get right into it. On one side, you have Darwin's theory of evolution. I mean, it's pretty much the foundation of all modern biology. But then, the Quran tells us that Allah created the first human, Adam, from clay. And at first glance, those two stories, they seem impossible to square, right? So can you be a faithful Muslim and accept evolution? Well, the answer is way more complex and, honestly, a lot more interesting than you might think.
This is the big one. This single question is at the very heart of a huge intellectual debate in the Muslim world today. It feels like it's pitting science directly against faith, our physical origins against our spiritual ones. It forces a question that makes a lot of us feel really uncomfortable. Darwin or Adam? Do we actually have to choose?
So let's break it down. On one hand, science gives us the story of common ancestry, of gradual change happening over millions and millions of years, all driven by natural selection. But on the other hand, the Quran talks about a special creation, Adam, who is infused with a divine spirit and given this secret trust to be a steward on earth. I mean, these seem like two totally different stories. But the real question is, are they actually in conflict? To figure that out, we have to look a little closer at what each narrative is really trying to say.
All right, let's start with the science. This whole framework is really about one thing: explaining the how. The physical process that brought all life, including us, to its current form.
Look, the evidence for evolution is just overwhelming. And it's not from just one place, it's drawn from all these different fields of study. We see it right there in the fossil record, which documents these incredible transitions over millions of years. We see it in our own DNA, which reveals these deep, deep genetic connections to other life. We see it when we compare the anatomy of different species, and we've even watched new species emerge in real time. For almost every scientist out there, this isn't some big controversy. It's the very bedrock of modern biology.
If you need just one number to kind of wrap your head around the power of this genetic evidence, here it is. We share 98.7% of our DNA with chimpanzees. That single fact is just such a powerful clue pointing to a shared ancestor deep, deep in our biological past.
Now, this is really important. We have to be clear about what evolution is not. It doesn't explain how life first started. That's a totally separate question. And its main driver, natural selection, isn't just some random chaotic process. And this is the big one. The theory of evolution makes absolutely no claim, none whatsoever, about whether God exists. So here's the key takeaway. Evolution is a scientific theory about a physical process. It's not a philosophical statement about ultimate reality.
Okay, so now let's pivot. Let's turn to the Quran. Because if science is focused on the how, you'll find that Scripture is overwhelmingly concerned with the why. Our purpose, our meaning, and our unique spiritual place in the universe.
Right at the core of the Quran's story about us is this concept of Khalifa. This one word really defines humanity's role. We're not just here to exist, we're meant to act as God's stewards on earth. And you'll notice, that's a moral and a spiritual job title, not a biological category.
And that brings us to another huge concept, the Ruh, or the divine spirit. The Quran describes Allah fashioning Adam and then breathing into him from his own spirit. And that singular event is what makes humanity different. It marks this moment of spiritual discontinuity, you could say, that sets us apart from every other creature.
So when you put all that together, you come to this really fundamental realization. The Quran is not meant to be read like a biology textbook. Its verses about creation aren't there to explain scientific mechanisms. They're there to reveal a theological reality, our purpose, our responsibility, and our unique, special relationship with God.
So, given these two pretty distinct narratives, how have Muslims actually tried to reconcile them? Well, there's no single, simple answer. Instead, what you find is this really wide spectrum of scholarly views, and each one has its own logic and its own reasoning.
So on one end of the spectrum, you've got a complete rejection of evolution, holding to a very literal, instantaneous creation of Adam. Then there's a really common position, often called human exceptionalism, which basically says, okay, evolution is fine for all other life, but humans were a special direct creation. Moving along, you have what's called theistic evolution. This view sees evolution as the very tool God used to create, with the soul being divinely given to an already evolved physical body. And then, all the way at the other end, you have a fully metaphorical view, which sees the story of Adam not as biological history at all, but as this profound parable about what it means to be human.
And what's so fascinating is that this kind of thinking isn't just some modern reaction to Darwin.
I mean, you go all the way back to the 14th century, and you have the great historian Ibn Khaldun writing about a gradation in creation, moving up from minerals to plants to animals, and then finally to humans. For a lot of people, that sounds remarkably similar to an evolutionary framework, and this was centuries before Darwin was even born. And all this brings us to what might just be the most important insight for navigating this whole topic. Maybe, just maybe, science and scripture aren't giving us competing answers to the same question. Maybe they're answering two completely different questions.
Here it is, laid out as simply as possible. Science asks how we got here. It's describing the physical mechanism, our bodies and our biological connection to all other life. The Quran asks why we are here. It's describing our purpose, our divine soul, our ruh, and our spiritual uniqueness. It's totally possible for both of these to be true, with each one operating in its own domain of knowledge.
So, what are the big takeaways here? First, the idea that humanity has a special spiritual status, a divine soul, is absolutely central to the Quranic worldview. Second, the exact physical mechanism of how we came to be, well, that's an area where there's room for legitimate scholarly disagreement. But here's the thing. It's crucial to avoid the dangers at both extremes. Rejecting established science can cause a real crisis of faith for a lot of people. But at the same time, reducing scripture to just a metaphor can kind of empty it of its spiritual power.
And so, at the end of it all, we're left with this one essential question. Can we embrace the scientific how of our biological origins without losing that profound theological why that gives our lives meaning? For the modern believer, figuring out how to navigate that question isn't just a challenge, it's the journey itself.